pay of $100,000. So to suggest that there's been some sort of pay freeze in place, I would argue is wholeheartedly incorrect. It is a matter of fairness and balance. I appreciate Mr. Duffy for his fine work in bringing this bill forward, because we should limit the pay of members of Congress. We should also do so for the federal civilian workforce. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time.
Madam Speaker,
Madam
Speaker, I find it interesting that the other side constantly brings up the CBO report. The much better report is the Bureau of Labor Statistics report. They're more experienced at this, and they show that federal employees were paid 26% less than private sector employees. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished lady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
Gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, Washington is the headquarters of the Congress. It is not the headquarters of federal employees. 85% of them live in our cities and towns and suburbs. Let's all agree that deficit reduction is a priority. And it is appropriate to lead at the top. Nor should federal employees be exempt from this leadership by example. But it does stop at the top, not at the bottom of the federal workforce. These employees live under often greatly differing standards of living depending on where they live in the country. It is up to us to lead by example, not federal employees, although they should not be exempt from this leadership role. It is an unfair ruse to pair the most favored federal employees, members of Congress, with the least favored federal employees across the board. Some are paid a great deal, some are paid very little, some come from high-cost areas of the country, some come from low-cost areas of the country. Look, most of our constituents will understand who we were voting for and who we were voting against. Democrats have a long history of respecting civil servants. Republicans have spent years deriding them in good times and bad. They know full well also that Congress would not dare take a raise now, and they know that federal employees should not become, as they apparently have, the proverbial piggy bank to pull down for all-purpose deficit reduction. Yeah, we had freezes that were almost automatic on federal employees. That's the very reason why this bill should be sent to committee to determine what is fair now in the third year after $60 billion in may I have 30 seconds more?
Additional 30 seconds.
Precisely because there have been two almost automatic freezes with no hearings means it is the time to send this bill to committee to determine what is fair for federal employees. Have they contributed enough, or, using my standard, leadership by example, should they contribute more? You want to lead by example? Members of Congress should stand up and ask for a freeze for themselves, by themselves, like men and women. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I have no other speakers and will continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Speaker, I grant the first of all, how much time do we have?
Gentleman from Maryland has 7.5 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Florida has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Maryland.
I grant 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mrs. Lynch.
Gentleman from Massachusetts, recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 3835, which would extend the current 2-year pay freeze for federal workers for an additional year through 2013. This will be the third year of a pay freeze. Similar to most of my colleagues who have spoken here today, I do support a freeze for Congress. I have voted 6 times to freeze Congress's pay. But and while my good friend from Utah does point out that there are some high-end, high-salaried federal employees, you have to remember that we have surgeons at the VA, very competent doctors at the VA that serve our veterans. We have scientists at NIH. We have very, very good attorneys at the SEC prosecuting very complex fraud cases, and to attract those individuals, we do need to attract very competent and highly skilled individuals, and that's where those higher salaries are aggregated. But we should be reminded that the vast majority of our federal employees are middle-income earners. And oddly enough, we could have addressed this if this bill had gone through committee, through regular order. This bill has come to the floor without going through committee. It has not been subject to amendment. We could have come up with a bill that said, okay, we're going to freeze the pay of high-income federal employees. We didn't do that. So you got people out there making $30,000, $40,000 a year, secretaries and other staff, that their pay has been frozen for it'll be, if this goes through, it'll be 3 years. So we could have done a better job if this bill had gone through the regular order and gone through committee. I'm also concerned about the rationale behind this legislation. Similar to many of my colleagues today, while I support the freeze on congressional pay, we see a lot of legislation coming up in this Congress that attacks federal employees. And I think this is one more example of that. I totally oppose it.
I grant the gentleman an additional minute.
I thank the gentleman. This is another in a series of legislative attacks that have targeted our federal workers throughout the 112th Congress. It will further erode employee morale and diminish the federal government's ability to attract the best and brightest to perform the important jobs that we need to perform. Our dedicated civil servants play a vital role in such critical areas as law enforcement, national defense, public health, and the delivery of services to America's veterans, elderly, and the disabled. They should not bear a disproportionate burden when it comes to addressing our nation's budget problems. So I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing any further efforts to balance the nation's budgets on the back of our hard-working federal employees by voting no on H.R. 3835. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Gentleman from Utah, 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, earlier it was referenced that there was another study showing that 26%, that the compensation was 26% lower than the private sector. I would point out that that did not include compensation for benefits. Certainly when you look at somebody's total compensation plan, you've got to look at the benefits that they're achieving. I would also point out in the CBO study on page 10 and 11 that total compensation is actually more more askew for the lower educated people. People that are earning high school diplomas or less are getting a 36% more than they would in the private sector. It's actually these higher end, these white people with professional degrees or doctorates that actually are probably being undercompensated, at least according to this study. And they only account for about 7% of our workforce. So if you look at the bulk of our workforce, some 93 roughly percent, you're going to see double-digit percentage increase versus the private sector. This is not an attack on our federal workforce. Be grateful that you have a job. What we have to understand is it's taxpayers' money, and we have to be frugal with it. Yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
All right, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Virginia for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I thank my very good friend, the distinguished ranking member of the committee, for yielding me the time to rise in strong opposition to an extension of the current pay freeze for federal employees. This legislation is a cynical attempt to tap into misguided resentment fostered by the far right against the federal government and the 2 million men and women who serve our nation as civil servants. Of those 2 million, let me point out to my colleagues, nearly 2 out of 3 civil servants work for the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Department of Justice. In other words, 2 out of 3 federal employees work in jobs related to our national security, at home and abroad, or caring for our veterans. Every one of those employees now seems to be the target of this body's misguided anger, and that's just wrong. Most of our federal employees work for the Defense Department to enhance our security. Employees at the Department of Homeland Security work to ensure nuclear materials aren't smuggled into our country by those who want to do us catastrophic harm. The Federal Bureau of Investigation works to investigate and prosecute cyber criminals that steal billions of dollars of intellectual property from our defense and civilian industrial base every year. This body claims to care about preventing nuclear terrorism and halting cybercrime, yet we want to punish those that are charged with carrying out that mission. Last year, a constituent of mine was awarded what's called a SAMI from the Partnership for Public Service for his work at the VA, helping to address veterans struggling with the human toll of warfare. My constituent has devoted 30 years of a career building a national network of small community-based centers where veterans traumatized by combat obtain counseling, job assistance, medical referrals, and other services. The partnership rewarded him last year, but today the House wants to forfeit his pay raise for a third consecutive year. This bill is the product of an ideologically extreme group of people who got elected by insisting that our government is broken, and now that they're elected, they want to try to prove that that be the case. It is not the case. We ought to be proud of our government and reject this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Madam Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Madam Speaker, as I listen to the debate and listen to the other side, and I do want to associate myself with the words of my colleague, Mr. Moran, and the others that have spoken. Over and over again, we hear on one side of the mouth coming from our Republican colleagues that they love our federal employees so much and that they do such a great job, but on the other hand, they say they want to freeze their pay. And one of the things that I've found so interesting, and we've heard the argument over and over, is when it came to the taxes with regard to the millionaires and billionaires, they didn't want to tax them one penny more, not one dime. But yet and still, the person who works here in this building, the ones that work at Social Security and other places, the ones that Mr. Moran just talked about, the ones who are protecting the homeland, say to them, we want to make sure we freeze your pay. There's something awfully wrong with that picture. I believe very strongly that we all should share in benefits, but we should all share in sacrifice too. He didn't ask for one dime, not a dime more, from the millionaires and the folks that are making all the money. But yet and still, you've got people in the federal system, according to the CBO report, if we want to go there, and that CBO report says that of those people with a master's degree or above, they are making 23% less. What about them? What about the people who day after day sacrifice and could possibly be making a lot more money in the private sector? What about them? Some of them, by the way, are on our staffs. And so I would just urge it's been implied that we on this side have a problem with a pay freeze for our members of Congress. We don't have a problem with that. We're going on the record saying that. And these issues should be divided. And so with that, Madam Speaker, I would urge the members of the Congress to vote against this very bad bill.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm new here. I'm one of those freshmen. I'm one of those freshmen that have been told you don't know how Washington works. I'm one of those freshmen that says you need to get in line, that have been told you need to get in line. Well, if successive 4 years of trillion-dollar deficits is the way Washington works, then I don't want it working that way. You see, I wasn't sent here to learn how Washington works. I was sent here to change the way Washington works. And when we have a president proposing a military budget that cuts our military back to pre-World War II levels, and yet we continue to increase our federal payroll while private sector payrolls and employments go down, there's something wrong with the way Washington works. Washington is broken. And I submit to you that we need to lead by example. We have done so already by reducing our MRAs, our members' accounts, by 11%. We've done so already by reducing our committee budgets. But we need to go further if we're going to lead by example. Because you see, leadership is not a title. Leadership is an act. And I submit to you, Madam Speaker, that today we lead by example, and I urge my colleagues to support the passage of H.R. 3835, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. All time has been expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3835? And those are in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The gentleman from Florida.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. And pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Who wants this? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 496.
And the clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 104, House Resolution 496, Resolution adjusting the amount provided for the expenses of certain committees of the House of Representatives in the 112th Congress.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady, will each control 20 minutes, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.Res. 496.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might consume.
And the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H.Res. 496. This resolution adjusts the amounts provided for the expenses of the Select and Standing Committees of the House of Representatives in the 112th Congress. Last November, the Committee on House Administration held a full-day hearing at which we heard from our chairs and ranking members. At that hearing, we discussed how each committee absorbed the 5% budget reduction implemented at the beginning of the 112th Congress, and how, as we continue to reduce government spending, they will manage additional reductions this year. Madam Speaker, I know as a committee chairman myself that we face the difficult task of doing more with less. Yet I also know that my constituents, all of our constituents, need us to do more with less and to rein in government spending. They ask constantly. We have been required, that is, families have been required to tighten their belts, and they ask us to do the very same thing. They do not suggest it is easy because it has not been easy for them, but they ask of us that which they have asked of themselves. Today's economy has forced our constituents to sacrifice and, as I say, tighten their financial belts to make ends meet at home. Congress should not and will not be immune. While most committees are taking a 6.4% cut in line with the reduced funding levels of the 2012 legislative branch appropriation, certain committees, faced with additional oversight responsibilities in 2012, were cut at a smaller percentage in order that they might be able to conduct their work. Particularly daunting will be the Armed Services charge of managing the automatic sequestration of $600 billion in defense cuts triggered by the Budget Control Act. And I hasten to add that is in addition to or on top of the $400 billion cut that is already being enforced by prior decisions by this Congress and the President. In addition to Armed Services, the Ethics Committee, tasked with holding members and staff to the highest ethical standards, has requested and will receive a reprieve from funding reductions. To help offset these exceptions and match the reduced appropriations, we've identified and reduced authorizations of 3 committee budgets that we feel are able to absorb a slightly larger reduction in 2012. In addition to our committee, the Committee on House Administration, the Committee on Science, Space and Technology, and the Committee on Small Business will receive a slightly higher reduction than the 6.4% applied to the remaining House committees. Madam Speaker, as we've demonstrated over the past year, this House is committed to living within its means and leading by example by putting an end to excessive spending. Our committees do vitally important oversight of the executive branch and federal agencies, and that ought to be underscored. If we are, in fact, going to be successful in holding down, controlling spending in the executive branch, we, the legislative branch, are the extension of the people we represent in an oversight capacity, and that is an extremely important responsibility. Our committees, as I say, do vitally important oversight of the executive branch and our federal agencies, and while these reductions in committee funding will require committees to allocate their resources more judiciously, I am confident, based on the hearing that we had, that they are prudent and manageable. Madam Speaker, these are extraordinary times. We face extraordinary debt, deficits, and unemployment. Trillion-dollar deficits year after year after year would be practically unheard of just a couple of years ago. Yet, unfortunately, they have become commonplace. That is unacceptable. The unemployment rate. We've had an unemployment rate, well, we haven't had an unemployment rate at the levels we have seen for such a sustained period of time since the Great Depression. Those are not facts that I like to recite on this floor, but those are the real facts that face our constituents every single day. Unfortunately, in my area, over the last several years, we have had a higher unemployment rate than that which has prevailed in this country. California has had an unemployment rate that I believe has been third worst in the entire country. We are not immune from what is being felt by the rest of the country. And when I am home, as I'm sure as other members have found in their districts when they are home, we constantly hear the refrain, "Where are the jobs?" And following that, we hear the refrain, "Why don't you get your house in order?" referring to the entire federal government. Why don't you bring spending under control, because we believe it has a specific and direct and immediate drag on our ability to create jobs in this country. That ought to be, along with national defense, homeland security, our greatest objective. And so, this is just a small part of our effort to be responsible. Through the adoption of this resolution and the 5% cut during our first session and of the 112th Congress, this House is doing a job, its job, to step up to the plate and reduce spending and find cost savings wherever possible. We are taking bold steps to demonstrate our commitment to reduce spending and tighter budgets. This is not easy. I don't suggest it is. It is not easy to say that we're going to bring our budgets down and that our employees are not going to have increased salaries along with members of Congress. But it is at least what we ought to do. Combined, I would say, these measures, that is last year and this year, represent the largest percentage cut to committee budgets since the 104th Congress, when the House then adopted a resolution with an amendment by then House Administration Committee member John Boehner to reduce committee funding by 30%. Madam Speaker, H.Res. 496 was reported out of the committee in December, and I now look forward to its passage by the House. I support H.Res. 496, urge my colleagues to do the same, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to House Resolution 496, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam. Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to House Resolution 496, which will reduce spending in most of the committees of the House by an average of 6.4% below the level provided in House Resolution 147, which was adopted last March. That resolution, which was passed the House unanimously, cut committee funding 5% lower than the levels for the 111th Congress. I have been pleased to work in a bipartisan fashion with my friend and my chairman, Mr. Lundgren, to find ways to reduce the cost of running Congress. We have worked together in funding cuts in printing, subscription, and technology services. And we have worked together opposing cuts to the Capitol Police and providing for the safety of our visitors and our staff. But this deeper cut to committees is the wrong cut at the wrong time. In reality, we have no idea what the effect these new cuts will actually have on committee operations. Testimony at our committee oversight hearing last November by both chairs and ranking members confirmed that additional budget cuts could undermine our ability to conduct legislative and oversight operations. I am fearful that further cuts to committees could continue to handicap our ability to effectively oversee the executive branch. We are cutting deeply into committees who oversight billions of dollars of federal spending. We may not agree on this resolution, but we certainly agree that Congress is the first watchdog on executive power and executive spending. We need the necessary tools, and they need the necessary tools to do that work. I urge my colleagues to defeat this resolution. I urge a no vote, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California.
At this time, Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper. He's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Elections on House Administration.
Gentleman from Mississippi, recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a member of the Committee on House Administration, I rise in support of H.Res. 496, the 2012 committee funding resolution, with full knowledge of the impact the reduced funding levels contained in this measure will have on the committee system. For example, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, on which I also serve, stated during the day-long hearing on this resolution that his committee would not be able to hold valuable field hearings during 2012 and would have to restrict other committee activities. More severe still, more than one ranking member stated that committee staff would have to be laid off as a result of the funding reductions contained in the resolution. This is unfortunate, but many American families have faced reduced activities and layoffs as a result of the current economic times, and Congress cannot exempt itself from such pain. This resolution will roll back committee funding to pre-2007 levels and is, I think, a necessary action as we cut spending throughout the federal budget. The committee went to considerable length to be fair both to all the chairmen but also to the minority, with no change made to the traditional funding split between majority and minority. This resolution will mean that the current Congress will spend almost 10% less than the previous Congress did. It requires every member of this body in a nonpartisan manner to participate in the austerity that the American people and the rest of their government are experiencing. I commend Chairman Lundgren for his work on this resolution, and I urge a yes vote on the resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I continue to reserve.
Continues to reserve. The gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey, who is chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight on the House Administration Committee.
Gentleman from Georgia for 3 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of H.Res. 496, the chairman of the House Administration Committee, Mr. Lundgren. With all due respect to the ranking member, Mr. Brady from Pennsylvania, I have to agree with the chairman that this runaway spending that we have seen occur over the last 4 to 6 years has got to stop. And the American people clearly, Madam Chairman, are looking to members of Congress to tighten their own belt. And that's why I think it's very important that we give them the message that we're willing to cut our own salaries, we're really willing to cut our own benefit package, and we have done that. We have voted to do that. And these cuts, as painful as they are in regard to our House committees, indeed 9.5% when we include this cut overall of the committees, although we do cut the House Committee on Armed Services by a lesser amount, and we plus up the House Ethics Committee, and we think that's very important. It is so crucial that we bite the same bullet that everybody else has to bite. And this bloated spending, this runaway spending that occurred during the previous majority in this House has got to stop. Spending $850 billion on a failed stimulus program, increasing the deficit, doubling it, in fact, having over $1 trillion worth of deficit spending for now 4 years in a row when we anticipate the President's next budget. This has got to stop. So we have to put our money where our mouth is. We have to walk the same walk that everybody else, and we have to tighten our belt. So, Madam Speaker, that's why I stand here today as a member of the Committee on House Administration and one of the subcommittee chairs in strongly endorsing and supporting these necessary painful cuts in House Res. 496. I hope we'll have support on both sides of the aisle. I'm confident we will. I respect, as I say, the ranking member. He's a great member. He works in a bipartisan way, and that's what this is all about. And we yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I continue to reserve the balance.
Continues to reserve. The gentleman from California.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Nugent, a distinguished member of the House Administration Committee and the Rules Committee.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of this resolution. This is an important resolution because it brings us back to the greatest cut since the 104th Congress. You know, in tough times like today, where the American people are pinching pennies to get by, shouldn't they have the same expectation of those that serve them in this great House? I believe they should. You know, when talking to people in my district, they ask and say, what are you doing to get your house in order? And so by supporting this piece of legislation, this truly talks about cutting the spending in D.C. While it's a small amount in comparative to the whole budget, it is in the right step in the right direction. It is about doing more with less. American people are doing that today. So why shouldn't this government do the same thing? I appreciate where the chairman has brought us in regards, Mr. Lundgren has brought us in regards to this important piece of legislation. It really moves us in the right direction. Cuts across the board are tough. And if you notice what this committee did is it didn't cover everybody the same, didn't treat everybody the same. And under Chairman Lundgren's leadership and also the ranking member, they did it, I believe, in a bipartisan way that didn't take away from the minority in regards to funding as it relates, nor differently than they did from the majority. So, Madam Speaker, I strongly support this resolution as we move forward to cut the budget of committees in this House, just like the American people have had to cut their budgets in their House. Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Madam Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close out the debate. I have no other speakers, so if the gentleman would finish his time, I would be happy to as well.
I thank the
gentleman from
again.
Pennsylvania.
I urge my colleagues to defeat this resolution, and I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I would just say that this is an effort on our part to give an example to the rest of the government. This will be a culmination of about a 10% cut overall to the committees of this House. We have had combined cuts in terms of our own MRAs, that is the amount that each member has for his budget. And I think as we go forward and having to make some very difficult decisions with respect to future controls of spending on the federal establishment in its entirety, it will serve us well that we have shown the way that we can make difficult decisions in this regard and that this is an appropriate, responsible action to take. And with that, I would urge my colleagues to vote for H.Res. 496 and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and the question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 496? Those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
This is concurrent 90. Okay.
Purposes the gentleman from California rise.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on House Administration be discharged from further consideration of House Concurrent Resolution 90 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
Clerk will report the title.
House Concurrent Resolution 90, concurrent resolution authorizing the printing of the 25th edition of the pocket version of the United States Constitution.
Is there objection to the consideration of the concurrent resolution? Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam
California. Gentleman from California.
Thank you. The original Sunshine State. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on House Concurrent Resolution 90.
Without objection. The gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the standards for the electronic posting of House and committee documents and data which were adopted by the Committee on House Administration on December 16, 2011, be printed in the Congressional Record.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the standards for the electronic posting of House and committee documents and data.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3567 as amended.
And the clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3567, a bill to amend Title IV of the Social Security Act to require states to implement policies to prevent assistance under the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families TANF program from being used in strip clubs, casinos, and liquor stores.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Bustani, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, will each control 20 minutes, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to exclude extraneous material on the subject of the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield such time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today, Madam Speaker, in support of H.R. 3567, a bill to ensure taxpayer dollars in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program are used as intended, and that is to provide support to low-income families and children and to help them move from welfare to work. The TANF program was created in 1996, replacing the prior welfare program with one focused on work, providing short-term help, child care, and other work supports to get people back on their feet and earning a paycheck. In the years following, TANF was lauded as one of the most effective reforms in our social welfare system in American history. Employment rates of those on welfare surged, caseloads plummeted, child poverty rates fell, and taxpayers were confident they were actually helping poor families, knowing that they were providing them with a hand up and not a handout. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, an issue has arisen in TANF that is eroding public confidence in the program. This is the issue of TANF funds, money meant to help poor children and their families, being accessed and used in liquor stores, strip clubs, and casinos. What started less than 2 years ago as research by one reporter in Los Angeles has grown into dozens of investigations across the country, with each new investigation adding to the story of how millions of dollars in TANF funds have been accessed in these locations. Let me just mention some of what has been uncovered. An Arizona investigation found welfare funds were accessed in liquor stores over 100 times in just 3 months. A California reporter uncovered that welfare recipients cashed out over $4.8 million in TANF funds in casinos over a 3-year period. A Colorado news organization found cash was being withdrawn in strip clubs, casinos, and liquor stores, despite a state law on the books prohibiting such transactions. An investigative report in Georgia revealed $150,000 in TANF money was withdrawn in liquor stores, bars, and nightclubs. King 5 News in Seattle found 13,000 TANF recipients who had collectively withdrawn approximately $2 million from casinos in 2010. Madam Speaker, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable to the American people. When the LA Times revealed their shocking statistics on the millions in welfare that had been accessed in casinos, liquor stores, and strip clubs, the governor of California took action to block these transactions immediately. Washington and New Mexico have prohibited access to welfare benefits in casinos. Texas prohibits the use of welfare benefit cards in liquor stores and casinos as well. The legislation before us today would ensure that taxpayer dollars in the TANF program are being used as intended, and that is to assist poor families with their basic needs and to support them in their efforts to become self-sufficient. Under this bill, states would be required to block welfare benefit card transactions in casinos, liquor stores, and strip clubs, and would be penalized if they do not implement such policies within 2 years of this bill becoming law. This bill will also help restore the public's trust in the integrity of the program while ensuring families across the country continue to receive the assistance they need to move from government dependence to independence. The bill we're considering today simply consists of one of the TANF provisions in H.R. 3659, the Welfare Integrity and Data Improvement Act that was unanimously passed in the House in December. A provision closing what has been called the strip club loophole was also included in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act that also passed the House in December and is now in conference with the Senate. With the exception of several technical changes suggested by the Department of Health and Human Services, it is also identical to bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate last year by Senator Hatch and co-sponsored by Senator Baucus, the ranking member and chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, respectively. I thank them for their hard work on this bill as well. Passing this bill today will send 3 clear messages. First, the House is serious about this bipartisan, bicameral reform becoming law, ensuring welfare funds are spent on families and children as intended. Second, conferees on the year-long payroll tax, UI, and TANF extenders bill should include this bipartisan provision in their conference agreement. And third, if those conference discussions break down, the Senate will be able to join us in quickly passing this important bipartisan reform and getting it to the President's desk. I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas.
I would yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm against fraud. I think everyone here is against it. I'm for what's in this bill. That's why I voted for it back in December. And I'll vote for it next month, too, if that will make for more cooperation here in the House. I think, in a way, this is this election year's welfare Cadillac. And I was against welfare Cadillacs if there ever were any of those, too. This year we have the strip club loophole that has been defined as a political term to suggest that we have a lot of problems with poor people abusing their benefits. And to the extent that any poor person abuses even $1 of these benefits and keeps those benefits out of the mouths of hungry children, providing the clothes those kids need to go to school, I'm against it, and I plan to vote against it today. I favor comprehensive legislation against fraud in public assistance. It concerns me when a pharmaceutical company ends up having to settle for $158 million in my home state of Texas because they allegedly lied about drug safety and bribed officials. It concerns me when a pharmaceutical company in the state of Texas has an $84 million fraud case brought against them. I think we need to be concerned about fraud in all of its aspects. I'd feel better about this bill, however, because I think repassing it will accomplish practically nothing. I'd feel much better about this legislative effort if there were just an ounce of the concern that is voiced about the very few people who abuse these benefits, if the same level of concern was expressed about the many who are there who are counting on the safety net, as flawed and frayed as it is, who were concerned about them and their families and their struggle to share in the American dream, and were doing something to get that approved. Yes, we approved this piece of legislation as part of a broader extension of the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program in December, and why hasn't that become a law? It is separate legislation pending in the Senate. It is also part of the broader legislation extending the provisions on unemployment, on payroll tax relief. It ought to become law because we need to be concerned about those families that are playing by the rules as well as the very few who are not playing by the rules. Now, the gentleman has said that in some states action has already been taken, California notably, to deal with the few who might be cashing their benefits at a casino or a liquor store or whatever. Texas, my home state, was cited as one of those states that has already taken action. I think that's great. There is not anything to keep the states from taking action on this already if this is a serious problem. Now, some of them have not acted not because of a lack of concern about fraud, but because the mechanics of correcting these electronic benefit cards may actually be more expensive than the cost that is being experienced by the small number of people that might abuse the card. You take Arizona, for example. Governor Brewer has plenty of time to shake her finger in the face of the President of the United States, to enact legislation, support legislation, to discriminate against Hispanic families who have been in that state for longer than she and her family have been in the state. If she thinks this is a serious problem, why doesn't she act at the state level, as Texas and California and some other states have done, to address this problem? I would submit that while I don't object to this legislation in and of itself, that the bigger problem that we face is that the number of poor American families has surged over the last 4 years, up 27%. 10 million people are below what is officially agreed on as being the poverty line. And this Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program provides a very small portion of those families a little bit of assistance to have a chance to turn their lives around until they can find longer-term employment to provide for their families. And how much money are we talking about that might be abused or wasted at one of these facilities, which might just happen to be the maintenance crew at the casino that use their benefits there, or might just happen to be the only store convenient in a poor neighborhood is one that's mostly selling alcoholic beverages, that they choose to do that. How much might they be abusing? Well, let me tell you, in my home state of Texas, the median benefit for a single parent with 2 children is $244 for an entire month to take care of those 2 children, 16% of the poverty level. I want to be concerned, yes, about a dollar that is wasted. These are hard-earned tax dollars that go into these programs. We need to be concerned about every cent of abuse. But we also need to be concerned about the many who stand to benefit, who stand to have hope taken away if they don't see these benefits extended. And my concern about that is not merely academic, because last year, the bipartisan agreement that had extended through many years called the supplemental program, which was really a survival program for temporary assistance for needy families in poorer states like Texas, the Republicans chose to discontinue that program. Even though it had enjoyed bipartisan support, had received support letters from a number of Republican officials in our area, they chose to not continue that, and that has severely weakened the safety net in our state. That's not being continued. Whether they intend to abandon the entire temporary assistance for needy family program or cut it back substantially, it's hard to tell. The fact that they're going only with the very modest provisions of this bill and not pushing to provide assistance to all of those who need that help. And with that, I would yield back for now reserving the rest of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Louisiana.
Madam Speaker, I am very pleased to yield such time as he may consume to the distinguished chairman of the Subcommittee on Human Resources on the House Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman Jeff Davis from the great state of Kentucky, the author of the TANF reauthorization, who cares deeply about the integrity of this program.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to take a moment before speaking on this measure to respond to the gentleman's remark. My friend, the distinguished gentleman from Texas and ranking member on the subcommittee, We've worked very hard over the last year on the issue of data standardization, correcting flaws in the system. Got the first data standardization language in the history of the country enacted that would begin to address issues like this, and I would beg to respectfully disagree with the position that the ranking member took on this, talking about the idea of convenience with a casino or adult establishments. As somebody who grew up in interesting circumstances and has done a lot of volunteer work over the last 30 years with folks with challenges, the first question that I would ask is, if somebody is in need of assistance, what in the world are they doing using a card to get cash inside of a casino? And I'm not impugning anybody's integrity, but as somebody who can look across the river from where I live, where there are several casinos, there are more than enough establishments, and I think the deeper question that we have to address is how our funds are going to be used when we help those who are in need. There are legitimate needs that these people have, and we've got to make sure that this program is tight, that it has the integrity to function, so that every dollar is going to meeting those basic needs. And I think it's a very small thing to bring this type of integrity to the program. I rise in support of H.R. 3567, the Welfare Integrity Now for Children and Families Act of 2011, introduced by my close friend from Louisiana, Congressman Charles Bustani. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, is a program that provides support for low-income families and children that helps them to move from welfare to work. It was a successful reform since it replaced the New Deal-era welfare programs in 1996, and TANF has been successful at cutting welfare dependence by 57%. Are there opportunities to improve the program, to strengthen the program? Absolutely. There are a variety of issues in core processes that need to be addressed to bring more private sector practices into the management and administration of the program, like the data standardization that I talked earlier, to allow us to understand how funds are being used and how better to serve those who are being helped by providing information to those on the front line. Even more importantly, though, by promoting work among single parents, who are the most common welfare recipients, it helps significantly reduce child poverty in female-headed families over time. Even at today's elevated unemployment rates, TANF continues to promote more work and earnings and less poverty. Despite this overall progress, TANF can and should be strengthened. Recently, concern has been raised about TANF benefits being withdrawn and used at strip clubs, liquor stores, and casinos. This is inappropriate as the use of taxpayer dollars and outright abuse of taxpayer trust. Indeed, as my colleague from Louisiana highlighted, many local news investigations and exposés have verified this unfortunate abuse of a well-intended program. One of the most shocking reports to me was from King 5 News in Seattle, Washington. They discovered through an investigation that 13,000 TANF recipients withdrew approximately $2 million at casinos just in 2010. I think it's very reasonable from an oversight position to ask the question, why are they in the casino in the first place, and in particular, the use of these dollars can't possibly be met in meeting basic grocery needs and things like that in an establishment like that or in any other type of adult establishment. Luckily, some states like Washington, New Mexico, and Texas have begun to take action on a local basis, but I believe this is one issue that we need to address at the federal level, at the core, first by stopping this problem as a symptom, and then dealing with the deeper systemic and process issues that we can establish through data standardization and simple controls so these cards will not even work in such an establishment. H.R. 3567 would close this so-called strip club loophole within 2 years of enactment. The states would be required to block welfare benefit card transactions in casinos, liquor stores, and strip clubs. In plain language, welfare benefits could no longer be accessed at any of these facilities. This same provision was included in H.R. 3630, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, as well as H.R. 3659, a standalone TANF extension bill introduced by Congressman Eric Paulson, both of which passed the House in December. This bipartisan, bicameral program integrity provision will safeguard taxpayer funds from abuse and ensure that TANF benefits continue to provide a helping hand to families that are in need. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3567, and with that, I yield back, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you. Commending the gentleman for his service as our subcommittee chair and on the data issue that will be important in reducing any kind of abuse of public assistance. I would now yield 2 minutes to my colleague from the Budget Committee and someone who's very knowledgeable about this, Ms. Moore from Wisconsin.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strident opposition to the underlying bill. I think that it's fairly cynical in these tough economic times when half of all Americans are either in poverty or at the precipice of poverty, that Republicans want to impose even more barriers on families trying to access much-needed benefits. This is simply, I really don't think that this bill adds to self-sufficiency of families, but rather is just more mean-spirited berating of low-income people who are eligible for these benefits, much like the mythical welfare queen or even the food stamp president. This bill that includes the provision that blocks EPT cards from being used at liquor stores, strip clubs, and casinos, the proponents of this argue that there's no reason to use EPT cards in places like this. But I say it is an issue of universal access. I mean, if you want to stop to buy gas for your automobile and you live in Nevada and you work at one of the clubs or hotels, or you're living in a food desert in Chicago where the closest ATM is a liquor store, what stops people from going to Whole Foods and using the ATM card there and then going to a casino? It is just another effort to berate those people who are in the lower class. My colleague has already mentioned the additional burdens that this imposes on states and financial institutions to reconfigure thousands of ATMs. My friends on the right side love to use the term class warfare, and they love to say that we're just trying to pick on the 1% of this country. Will you yield 30 more seconds?
I give the gentlelady an additional minute.
Gentlelady is recognized.
But I say, who's really working for the least of these? Instead of hindering the American people, we need to be helping them to provide greater access. And instead of passing these unproductive, symbolic, mean-spirited pieces of legislation, we need to create jobs and opportunities. And I hope that the American people, Madam Speaker, can see the difference. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the gentlewoman for raising the concern about ensuring that TANF recipients have adequate access to their benefits in a variety of locations. That's a very important consideration. This bill requires states to block access to welfare benefits in casinos, liquor stores, and strip clubs. However, we know some grocery stores, convenience stores, and local markets may sell groceries but also sell alcohol. And in some states may have gambling machines there as well. And because of this, the bill allows states to make accommodations for such stores, so that they would not have to block transactions in places that sell groceries, but also sell alcohol as well, or where a grocery store happens to have a gaming machine, or if it's located in the same building or complex as a casino. There are provisions made in this. So I thank the gentlewoman for raising this issue, but I'm glad that we can ensure the integrity of this program. And I would submit the most important thing we can do is to ensure the integrity of the program so that it's there for the children and families that need it. And that we want to ensure that there's not an overt abuse of these funds in strip clubs, casinos, and liquor stores, while allowing for reasonable exceptions. Also, the gentlelady and the ranking member from Texas raised the issue of cost of implementation, and I want to address this issue as well. And I thank you all for raising that concern that some states, have expressed that we have a loophole that could potentially be too costly or too difficult to close. However, I want to point out that these difficulties have been overstated. Washington State said the same thing when they were told $2 million in TANF funds were being withdrawn in casinos in 1 year. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record an article from King 5 News in Seattle, Washington State, that speaks directly to this issue.
Without objection.
This article talks about the surprising number of TANF withdrawals in casinos in the state and reports that the state said the same things that we're hearing today, that it may be hard to close this loophole or that it would be too expensive to stop. But this article goes on to say, and I quote, It turns out the fix was not difficult or expensive. For the Iron Horse Casino, it took about 4 minutes on the telephone. Keeley, the casino owner, says in minutes and at no cost, his ATM vendor blocked EBT cards. Keeley and many other casino owners didn't wait for the orders from the state. They already reprogrammed their ATMs. He's a board member of the Washington Restaurant Association, which he says is preparing to ask bars and taverns, businesses that are more alcohol than food-oriented, to block EBT access to their cash machines. Keeley says that would mean another 2,000 ATMs couldn't be accessed for welfare cash benefits. So I appreciate the concerns about the cost, but I believe closing this loophole simply won't be as difficult as some are making it out to be. Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my